Right, I think we should begin. Are we all on that one? Okay, thanks so much, colleagues and friends and friends and friends, and those coming in as well. Thanks for joining us. Of course, to our students and staff and faculty from other parts of our own country and the globe, and of course our young academics. It's lovely to see all of you, see some of our visiting professors as well, people from the CUS and GDC networks, and then also some of our research associates. So that's fantastic, having you all as a community around you online in such trying circumstances. I hope you are all well and safe and good. So my name is Andre Kiet, and I am with Dina and Michael coordinating the Critical University Studies Network Africa. Dina is from Queen's University Belfast, and Michael is from the University of Ghana. So just by way of kicking off our colloquium, which will of course uh, people, have I been muted now the entire time now?
Just for a few
No,
minutes.
just for 1 second.
Just for 1 second. Yeah, and that's not on my part because I haven't touched anything. So just to say that by way of kicking off our colloquium and for the benefit of those joining for the first time, just a few historical notes. There were many discussions amongst us, some of us here, and of course, and especially with Dina, I think towards the end of 2018, that resulted in the first gathering, the CUS Winter School in 2019 at Nelson Mandela University, which has been supported by the Global Challenges Research Fund, a funding opportunity that was also driven by Dina. At that time, we had the thematic area of emancipatory imaginations, which suggested our discomfort with studying the university from within the dominant paradigms of higher education studies and higher education transformation studies. Hence, the drive to have a better articulation with critical university studies, which has its own possibilities and limitations, as we will show later on, and of course, which also requires forms of conversations with the decolonization and abolitionist movements in the higher education sector, and the key considerations of Africanizations and Black studies and Black reading. So in short, we are searching for alternative liberatory ways to study the university as a social colonial institution for radical praxis to take shape. We also, prior to being overrun by the COVID-19 pandemic, secured part funding for a follow-up colloquia and had in mind a jamboree of ideas and programs bringing together CUS, the Global Decenter Network, and Critical Mandela Studies. Of course, that could not happen, and the planned exchange trips to universities of Ghana, Uganda, and Ethiopia were also thwarted for the same reason, but we'll hope we can take this up again in the second part of this year. We had various movements and online events and discussions since August 2019, which will be reflected on later, and our series in Africa Knowledge also reflect on some of the big epistemic questions facing our own continent. We will see how things play themselves out over the next few months. For now, it is simply great to see you. So a warm welcome to all. I'm really looking forward to engaging with you. And please just don't forget about our sessions that will have Paul Zaleza and Shirley and Tate providing provocations that will follow. So for now, let me give over to Dina, our coordinator of the network. Dina.
Thanks so much, Andre. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it's really lovely to take this time, precious as it is with all of our commitments, time to think, to share, and hopefully to continue to learn about what we can and what we should do within this area of scholarship as individuals, but also connected as we are with and for each other. Of course, this has been such a hard 18 months since we had the winter school. And since we last interacted just months ago to share our reflections about the pandemic. I think it's important that we acknowledge that many of us and the higher education sector at large have during this time experienced the loss of loved ones, loss of those within our intellectual communities. Also considerable change to our time, security, health, belief on so many levels. So I think it's so important that we continue to try and create opportunities like this, to prioritize pauses for us to reflect, to explore, to continue to push what we can and feel should be done by academics, universities, and the role played particularly by critical university studies. So thank you to all of you here and to our two central contributors in the next few days. It's such an honor to have Professor Paul Zaleza and Professor Julian Tate to inform our discussions. Thanks, of course, to Michael and to Andre as fellow collaborators, and in particular, Andre's team for supporting this initiative and enabling it to happen. They're amazing. So I hope that all of you find it of value, and thank you so much for being here. Michael, if you would like to come in now.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to see all of you today. As you said, Dina, it's been a difficult year. I have two slides I'd like to use as a kind of background to our network. So, Jenny, would you please share my slides? Right, thank you so much. And sort of continuing from our conversation when we met during the winter school, I've been doing quite a bit of reflection on this whole network. And I think the network is just ordered to reclaim what is truly African, the university. I'm so interested in the history of the African university, which has been lying on the shelf, buried for such a long time. And would like to rediscover that, because that right is usurped, in my view. The university as a concept, an institution in Africa, is perhaps the oldest in the world, or if not among the oldest. It predates the European university imported into Africa in the 19th century, of which we're all part now, the colonial project. And that model has almost obliterated the African university as we know it. But Africa had universities prior to colonialism, which served as colossal cradles of knowledge, exactly known and celebrated in mainstream discourse on the academy today. And so, the second slide, please. And so that idea for me drives what we really are about. There is a foundation to build on. And that foundation is on these ancient institutions. Think of Cairo in Fez, Morocco, in the 9th century AD already, or Al-Azhar in Cairo and Sankara in Timbuktu between the 13th and the 16th century. We heard recently about danger of the Timbuktu manuscripts, which we nearly lost, but for tremendous work, which many people have been doing. And so couldn't the master-disciple relationship, the scholar-student model, characteristic of Sankara, for example, the thirst for knowledge and ideas, benefit the African university today? And so the central question of this colloquium, which is also the central question of our network, as you've seen in the papers that have been shared, is what might an African critical study of higher education look like? Some of the conversation we are going to have at this time will center on this question. The pandemic has shown us that the African ingenuity in fighting this COVID-19 has been great across many parts of the continent. And if the African university would intensify dialogue with the African society to solve its myriads of problems, life would certainly be worth living on the continent. And so our network, ACUSAfrica, should critique, draw on, and share best practices in pre-colonial, that's ancient Africa, post-colonial contemporary African universities. Those best practices across the continent today should form a kind of web of ideas to dismantle the imposed borders for the common good and advancement of Africa. I look forward to our conversation building on these ideas for us. Thank you very much. May I invite my friend Aslam to give us what the South African chapter is doing.
Yes,
So,
thank you very
Aslam?
much, Michael.
Yes, good to see you.
Thank you very much, Dina, Andre. Thank you very much for the opportunity to just briefly speak to you about a conversation or two, or maybe three, that we've had to constitute some kind of a network. Actually, more than a network, a set of conversations that will concretely lead to a number of objectives out of this network. With the proviso that the focus is on the critical study of the critical study of higher education in Africa. And we feel that in order to kind of grow this conversation productively and this network productively, we have to be very astute in the way we are organized. That, you know, as per usual, there has to be a couple of people who hold this thing together at the core. And then there has to be a proliferating possibility outwards into the growth, the co-optation and the generation of a set of scholars around these core objectives. So the core consists of a couple of people who are part of the network, and the role that they will have to fulfill is to develop levers, conceptual as well as operational as well as organizational levers, that gels, that galvanizes a conversation in the region, in Southern Africa, in South Africa, and so on, around a set of key starting off assumptions about what critical university studies in Africa is all about. Some of these things are, the first one is that we have to be rooted within the existing philosophical approaches to the study of universities. And that's actually the foundational ground from where we start. Part of that is to be rooted within the historiography, what's already been written. If you take the example of higher education in Africa, higher education in Southern Africa and South Africa, over the last 30 or 40 years, lots have been written. And so that becomes the conceptual ground for our starting points and for us to begin to locate a number of critiques and an analysis of shortcomings and gaps in respect of which we want to grow conceptions, newer conceptions of critical higher education studies out of that. So the locatedness within the kind of the philosophical orientation of the study of African universities, on the one hand, the conceptual work, the empirical work that pre-exists us, we have to, in a sense, master that, because they have a powerful hold. This historiography has a very powerful hold on how the study of the university in Africa is framed. But we want to suggest that a critical language must, in a sense, also eschew. It must challenge, it must contradict, it must overturn these older debates. So understanding the older debates is a basis fundamentally for overturning them. Such as, for example, we give the, in the 90s and in the 2000s, kind of a policy analysis in South Africa that was based on what is largely regarded as policy and political symbolism. So everything, whether people knew it or not, got read through the social reproductionist policy as symbolism lens. It operates almost invisibly. It operates almost by way of streamlining a debate that only gets us so far. I think we have to go beyond that. This critical language, this modernist, functionalist critical language has to be, colonialist critical language has to be fundamentally challenged. So we seek to develop heterodox approaches on the public purposes of universities, steered by historically located and future critical debates. We think that the argument makes three kind of spatial academic moves. It's got a heterodox understanding of the past. It has a generative understanding of the sociologies of the present, and it has a future critical view of the university. And the future critical view is normatively and theoretic and philosophically related to the world that's yet to come. Now, those three provides us the kind of the conceptual, if not spatial foundation. And so this stands at the nexus of our decolonial perspectives and what we have called in a document our techno-infused interruptions on the university, the latter of which has been fundamentally brought to the fore during COVID times, from which very troubling functionalist recipes have emerged about how technology will save us. The complexity of what has been called the post-human living in the context of climate change and technologically driven knowledge markets would become the foci for critical studies. We also think that rapidly emerging systems, new knowledge and disciplinary constellations, the rapid reorganizing of student and staff engagement, rapid reorganizing of universities' experience and so on, are core concentrations in critical higher education studies. So what we are going to try to do to bring all of these things together is to, in the first instance, develop a book project by 15 or so global, continental African thinkers who will help us map this terrain on the one hand. So we want to initiate a book where some of the leading thinkers on these matters can help us map the terrain on the one hand. And in parallel and intersecting with that kind of mapping work, we want to generate some conceptual, philosophical, and empirical studies via the broader network that can then begin to speak to this mapping processes. And we're hoping for that to work over the next 15 months, these two parallel projects that will converge in some concrete form via workshops, seminars, book writing processes, and so on and so forth. So very interesting times. The questions are heterodox. The answers are not to these questions have not been born yet, but it is through our conversation via this network that we will give birth to understandings that would be novel, would be incisive, and it would help us reframe the terrain of university studies in our domains. Thank you very much.
Michael,
thank you very much, Aslam. Thank you so much.
Something about the young academics?
Yeah, so the young academics, I didn't use that word for obvious reasons, Andre, but it's the young academics. And again, I'm not going to use that word. It is growing an academic conversation from the core that asks central questions that moves outwards into network dynamics in which younger academics, a greater diversity of academics are co-opted to participate in this conversation in concrete ways.
Good.
Thanks,
Thank you very much. And I like the passion with which we are engaging this.
Thanks. Thank you.
This project. Thank you. Dina, would you say something on the website which you've started?
Great, thank you, Michael. So those who were at the second part of the winter school in August 2019 will remember that during our workshop period, we deliberated about how to make the scholarship grow, how to make it matter, but we needed some sort of hub or place to network and share and connect asynchronously as well. So while it can't do all of this, we thought that a website would be one way to do this and to share what we do and invite others to contribute too. And so towards this, in September last year, we launched the website. On the second slide, you will see the URL. Oh, here it is, which you are welcome to take a peek at now, and the homepage. Thanks to all of you who have contributed to making this website happen and who included ideas and critical feedback. I'll just touch on a few of the features now in the next slide. So in addition to the shared online reference list that we have on the website, in the past few months, we've added information and links to many of the activities and events that have happened as part of this network, and also those from broader networks that we've included because we believe that there's value to the issues that we're deliberating. you'll see that the contributions are loosely structured by the topics on the very top tab, which are pretty small on your slide now. So just to tell you that starting on the left, we have African critical university studies, then we have critical university studies around the world, and then the question of how one engages with impact to advance critical university studies, and also reflexivity. Then on the last slide, you'll see that there are regular postings of news and events, including new books, book launches, talks, grants and fellowship opportunities, those sorts of things. Those who subscribe receive these to their mailbox. When I last checked, which was last Tuesday, there were 99 subscribers. So if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing. But what I'd really like to stress is that contributions are most welcome. If you're a person who would like to share about your own work, or to write critically about the work of someone else, or to share the work of your networks or research projects that you feel dovetail with that of the overall advancing critical university studies ethos, then please do step in. Let us know about the books and the papers and the policies that you've been part of and how you think they contribute to this larger conversation. Of course, I'd also like to welcome those who'd like to share the management of this with me, because I often don't pick up on events outside of my own interests and areas. On the right, you can see some of us have sent through a sense of what we're about, and those are hyperlinked to each person's choice of website, so that this site sort of acts rhizomously, opening up spaces and connections. So please send through your contributions and join us when you have the time. That's it for the website, Michael.
Great, great. Thank you so much. It's a lovely work. I like to look at our website again and again. Thank you. Jenny, would you please like to share with us the news on upcoming events?
Before Jenny does, I wonder if Jason and I could just have a chance to quickly highlight the book project.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Please forgive me. Okay. So first things first, thank you very much, everyone. It's really good to have everyone here. It's really just to say, obviously, we're kind of in a really difficult time at the moment, etc. But I think the kind of, I guess, collegiality that's kind of happened across the continent in terms of what we're looking to do has been like really powerful. And I guess a lot of what Dina and Andre and I have been trying to do, and everyone else within this colloquium and this kind of collective, is to try and really galvanize and situate and center the work into one particular area. So it's just kind of give you a brief update really from my Dina and I's perspective, and really just to thank everyone for all their work and contributions in terms of being on the project so far. It's really appreciated, and this will kind of, what we're trying to do is produce effectively an edited collection, which will kind of encapsulate lots of different ideas from contributors that are part of this particular collective group, and in terms of network, and really kind of insert the importance of, I guess, scholarship within the African diaspora. So kind of in April 2020, or what we were able to do is to put out a call to our members, as in all of you, and we managed to get several responses back. Again, just trying to ensure that we extended net as far and as wide as possible, because we really want to kind of situate the work we're doing and make sure that we maximize that work. And we're very fortunate to get 25 indications of interest, which resulted in having kind of 20 abstracts kind of solidified within the edited collection. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. And I guess in these kind of crazy times, it's an ongoing process because people have a lot on. It's really difficult. So there will be flexibility in terms of submissions, and where possible, Dina, Andre, and myself will be as lenient as possible to accommodate everyone in as best a way as possible.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. I mean, I thought it might be quite interesting just to add what we saw from those who submitted the chapter abstracts, just for everybody's interest. So out of those 20, about 7 pointed to critiques of the interpretive frameworks of critical university studies. A few pointed to counter histories and the need to review universities and intellectual formations, with some of those focusing particularly on decolonization, decoloniality, others on Africanization and indigenization. There's one from India on this too. Two on the Sustainable Development Goals. There are also vastly different disciplinary lenses that were being critiqued and used, including sociology, development studies, Black studies, African studies, gender studies, culture studies, literary studies, conflict studies, and higher education studies. Many are conceptual or philosophical in nature, although 6 aim to be part of a study on the institutional case studies, 2 about students in particular, and a few on academics. And then there are 2 of those on the sort of margins of academia. The texts engage with, if we're talking about context, they're wide ranging. They're with, about, or at least from higher education in South Africa, Ghana, India, Canada, Europe, a number of different places in Europe, the States, and Syria. So yeah, quite interesting to see how varied that is. And we'll keep you updated as time progresses. Thank you.
Great, that sounds wonderful, and points to a rich trove in this area. Thank you very much. Jenny.
Thanks, Michael. So we have the next upcoming ACUSAfrica event is a seminar. You can see it up on the screen. It's going to be led by Riyad Shahjahan, and it's about navigating Shomo Capes and faculty life in the Global South, Bangladeshi faculty perspectives. So it's a critical study on timescapes and temporality in the Global South. So that will be on the 17th of March. So this is just basically the promo for that. And then also related to continuing to build this network, we are busy conceptualizing a seminar series. So once we have a concept note and parameters for that, we will be sharing them with the network. So that's it from me. Thanks, Michael.
Sorry. So thank you so much. May I invite Dina to lead us for the next half an hour, looking at how we're progressing on building this critical university studies from the last winter school.
Great, thanks, Michael. So now we're just going to take a bit of time to hear of the progress, as Michael said, from some of the winter school attendees on building critical university studies in the different ways that they've done so. This will be quite brief. We've pretty much asked everybody just to spend about 5 minutes. But just to note, for those of you wanting to hear more or to access some of those texts, of course, they'll be in this recording, but we're also going to post the slides with hyperlinks on the website in this week. So I think the order that we have this in is that firstly, Sharon, if you can come in and just speak about your interactions.
Thank you so much. I wish I wasn't going first because I would like to see what everyone else does, but it's fine. I have my canine assistant here as well. Great to see everybody. Very glad and grateful to the organizers for putting this colloquium together. I wish we were in person, but someday. So I will just try to be really brief about the sort of things we have on over here in North America. The first is that with my collective, we have developed a workbook for decolonizing higher education. It is certainly focused on the Canadian and US contexts, so very much focusing on the Indigenous settler relationship, and not so much a how-to, but a series of sort of resources to think through and with the complexities that arise in decolonizing work. I also had so many random graduate students reaching out to me interested in either decolonization and or abolition, and would always meet with them and try and support them because they're usually the only person in their program working on this, and eventually decided, well, maybe you all want to create your own group of students working on this issue of decolonization and abolition in higher education. So I am supporting them and hopeful they will continue that work. I continue doing my work with the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. A lot of our work is focused on our collaborations with Indigenous communities in Brazil and Peru, but it very much informs the work that we also do about higher education in not always obvious ways. So we're very grateful for those collaborations, and also continue to fundraise for those communities who are facing ongoing colonial violence, especially right now in Brazil. The Critical Internationalization Studies Network continues to grow. Folks who are interested in, examining the power relations that tend to be reproduced in internationalization of higher education. We welcome new members at any time. I have an article in Press that is what can decolonial and abolitionist critiques teach the field of higher education. And I note this just because review of higher education in the North American context is kind of a big publication for higher education studies. And I don't think it's published because the article was so great, but I think it actually signals a shift in growing interest in these areas. So that makes me somewhat hopeful that it's sort of seeping a bit into the mainstream, although it's always a double-edged sword because it can also be co-opted and sort of tokenized as it becomes more popular. Also working on a book about the colonial foundations of US higher education, and hopeful that we can sort of link these critiques of colonization, across the continents, and continue building these transnational conversations. And then finally, I have a project about decolonizing STEM and health professions. So if any folks are working on this area, would be really glad for that to also have global sort of dimensions. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sharon. It's always lovely to engage with your work and read it too. Michalinos, I wonder if you can come in now because we'd really like to hear of your work too.
Good evening, everyone. Good morning. I think you can see me, right? Good. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about some of my recent projects. The colloquium has been really inspiring. So I'm currently engaged with these two papers that have been submitted to journals. The first one is on refusal and the driving questions of this paper are what sort of effective investments or disinvestments are needed in higher education to refuse the colonial university. How can educators and students in higher education invent pedagogies of refusal that function effectively to challenge colonial futurity? And what do pedagogies of refusal look like at the end of the day? So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to theorize refusal as an effective practice which produces political effects and desires that challenge normative manifestations of power and control. The second paper on effective studies of abolition pedagogies in higher education highlights the importance of paying attention to the effective strategies of abolition pedagogies in higher education to mobilize abolitionist praxis. Effective strategies can make a contribution in either changing or reproducing the affective culture that has long been established at the colonial university. So my analysis argues that the affective strategy of invoking sentimental empathy that is often used in education when we address issue of slavery, racism, and coloniality is not only superficial, but I argue that it also reproduces colonial feeling rules. So instead, what I'm trying to argue is that I suggest a number of effective strategies, such as mobilizing affective solidarity with the affective words of marginalized students and identifying complicity while engaging in anti-complicity praxis. And I argue that these strategies enable educators and students to begin imagining and enacting the abolition university. So that's for now. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our conversations.
Thank you so much, Michalinos. I'm next on the schedule. So I'll just touch briefly on 3 related projects. I've also been fortunate, and I know some of the authors are here today to contribute to studies on COVID, inequality, decolonization, and the digital in higher education. I include those within the slide that will go on the website, but for now, I'll mainly be focusing on the 3 areas in this brief time. So extending the network to parts of India has mainly been through the project on the left and the efforts of Dr. Nandita Dhawan, who some of you will remember from the winter school, but due to time differences is not with us today. So this first block relates to our project on which Grace Idahosa also collaborated. The project was on transformation and its possible relations to notions of inequality and sustainability within the academy, looking at Indian and South African higher education and their policies, interpretive frameworks, including sustainable development and social justice, and their commitments constitutionally and as heterogeneous academics. It's been an amazing project. What was also really good was the colloquium we organized with over 25 gender scholars and activists from Indian institutions in early 2020. And we held that at Jadavpur University in Kolkata. We've managed to produce quite a lot of the initial findings, despite the chaos of the past year. And so some of the insights from the projects are already out there, as you can see, with publications and grant applications in process too. Then there's the second block, counter narratives. Some of you may remember a short blog post, I think it was titled Art for Impact with a question mark around the counter narratives of higher education, which I put on the website in September. Well, this project relates to that, where creative arts research practice has been used to extend and complicate what has emerged in many of the research that we know well about, particularly about academics in modern Western-oriented university. These particular counter stories are from academics in Angola, Syria, South Africa, and India. The image is from the website, which was launched early in 2020. We've used it to engage in workshops with academics and students, and also produced a video paper, which I've referenced here, with more in the pipeline in partnership with Analog Eye Video Art Africa. We're really keen for people to engage with the work, to use it, to engage with the issues that they raise. It's why we created it, was the impact of it. So please do reach out if you want to use it. Then the third part I'd like to highlight for this network is about conflict and post-conflict academia. In addition to the blog post that you remember that Fateh Shaban, Tom Parkinson, and I posted last October raising the question of whether academics in exile and academia in conflict is the blind spot of critical university studies. Fateh was going to be here either today or this week. I hope he is. But what we wanted to say is that we've been working for the past few years together, and some of the publications are coming out as a product of that. The project, in addition to the project in the last bullet, which will commence this year, we are contributing to the book that's part of the Critical University Study Network, of course, looking at the limitations of current frameworks against the need for critical research in this area. But I'd particularly like to highlight the call for chapters that Tom and I put out on studying the living and being as academics in conflict and post-conflict. Again, I'd really like to just say, please reach out if you're interested at all. Now I'd like to hand over to Su Ming to speak about the work that she's done.
Thanks very much. It's such a pleasure to be here in this forum. So I'd organized my 5 minutes around this theme of collaboration and the objective or the aspiration of collaboration coming into African critical university studies as a collaborator who is outside Africa. And I want to organize it in this way that has come out of the project that I'm doing, which is funded by the Irish Research Council, the Because Project, which is a collaborative project with UNISA in South Africa. So the first phase of this project had identified various questions about elements to address questions about equity and quality in higher education, and how we could rethink quality to integrate concerns with equity. And the three kind of broad action areas were investments, insights, and pedagogy. So I kind of thought I'd organize it that way, because it's very difficult really to talk about collaboration in these very broad and multifaceted networks. And this is a good way of doing it, I suppose. So first of all, simply the insight that there are kind of three main areas, insights being one of them, but also investments and pedagogies. And the objective then in collaborating from outside Africa with Africans and African conversations about what critical university studies should be is really to learn more within my own practice, for disciplinary humility within my own practice, and towards some kind of transformative courage. And I think in those three dots of between thinking again about my own discipline and going towards something that we might be in common, is the three dots, I think, are about common effort or commoning, common striving, and dealing with some critical insights about what it is that corrodes or negatively affects common striving, which is generally in the political economy of higher education, which is turning our common striving, our commoning, our emancipatory desires for research, which might be full of richness in personal language and experience, emancipatory in practicing a non-competitive, solidaristic and collaborative working, which are against using technology in an emancipatory way that helps us to learn from each other and to foster learning. It was the beginning of this paper then. The link is there to thinking about what international collaboration might look like. So there's this paper I did for Sharon's conference that links me into that network, Repair of Public Higher Education. And I'm also contributing a chapter on this idea of repair and what it is that might be repaired. In terms of investments, I've tried to think more broadly about the things that we do practically. Again, back to thinking about, research that is full in its experience and trying to enrich the language of experience whilst thinking differently about how we invest that experience and that time and that effort and that labor and the love of what we do. So in the last year and a half, 2 years, I've really tried to experiment with different kinds of investments in collaborative writing, collaborative editing, collaborative publishing. So I have engaged a lot with the Convivial Thinking platform, which is partly organized by the European Association of Development Institutes, engaging with my own discipline of development studies. And we were very busy actually, we produced a special focus issue of Acta Academica, which has 6 articles. Link is there. It'll be up on the ACUS website. And also a really large special issue in the Journal of International Women's Studies on being in the middle of decoloniality, exploring in a lot of different disciplinary ways from many different locations in the world what is in the middle of decoloniality. Through my own discipline of development studies, then responding to the current COVID-19 and the Global South idea. And I've just shared that because the collaborative investment is producing different kinds of publications with different types of publishers and coming back maybe to low and no cost university-based academic publishing. In this case, a sponsored book with Bristol University Press, which is a not-for-profit, socially responsible publisher with good solidaristic values. And then investing also in different kinds of collaborations with people outside and beyond academia, with the European Commission funded Bridge 47 Knowledge Exchange Partnership. I've contributed a piece on thinking about solidarity, but also through engagement in that process with other participants in that process of knowledge exchange with civil society partners and non-university-based educators. A special issue in globalization, societies and education, on mobilizing global citizenship education for alternative futures, which kind of shades into the pedagogies area, but the pedagogies have just focused on the disciplinary excellence part and tapped into Erasmus schemes to address disciplinary excellence, addressing climate and migration crises, using a rights-based, rights from below and decolonial border thinking. We are going to have an article symposium on that in a couple of months. The links will be up when I have them. And last of all, then civic pedagogies through open access web-based resources and lectures, a project that is funded by the Discover Society Foundation, and it's called the Connected Sociologies Curriculum Project. It's an amazing project run by Gurminder Bambra, and contributed a lecture on colonial dispossession in this series. So I hope I didn't go massively over the...
No, that's perfectly fine. Thank you so much, Sue. I wanted to ask Christy van der Westhuizen, can you please come in now about the exciting volume that you've been part of?
Hello, everybody. Yeah, good to see you, even if only virtually. And it is really good to connect with people under these very, very difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in. I hope everybody is well, even given where we are at the moment. So, yeah, briefly, I have... actually, something that I didn't include on the slide that I should just mention is that I'm contributing a chapter along with Simpiwe Zondani, who's one of my master students, and he's also part of this meeting today, to the book that Dana was telling us about a few minutes ago. So that's the one project that's contributing to critical university studies. And then, but more specifically today, I just wanted to alert you to this edited volume that we are working on, called Making Visible the Invisible, Institutional Cultures in South African Higher Education. And on this, I'm working with a number of colleagues who, one of them is also in our meeting today, Nomalanga Mkhize, but also colleagues Babawa Mabukwana and Kawe Makabuka, who are my co-editors on this volume. And Andre is the series editor on this particular, well, the series that this book is forming part of, which is in Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation at Sun Media, Stellenbosch. So this project has been coming a while. We had a meeting towards the end of 2019. And then, of course, as we know, 2020 just threw things, scrambled things a bit for a lot of us. So, but we are back on track. And the book basically will be grappling with institutional culture, which is probably one of the most difficult phenomena to grapple with when it comes to higher education transformation. Definitely the most difficult to get a handle on, if one could say could say it that way. So we decided we had a call for papers, and we've divided this book into 4 themes to try and get at this slippery thing called institutional culture, which we regard as you know, you can change numbers, you can change structures, but there's also the much more amorphous and intangible so-called traditions, ways of doing, ways of thinking, obviously epistemologies come into that and so forth, that actually that reproduce the university, and that can be very insidious and can actually undermine transformation if it's quite substantially, as we've definitely seen in South Africa over the past 25 plus years. So we've got these 4 themes to try and get some kind of grip on it. The first is on discourse, subjecthood, and structure. The second is on institutionalized racism, metropatriarchy, and other violences. The third is on neoliberal corporatization, technology that's already been mentioned. And then the 4th theme is on ways forward or ways out of these one could say conundrums conundra, I don't know if there's such a word, that one's finding oneself in terms of transforming institutional culture. And we've received many abstracts. We've actually got about half of our chapters in. And the chapters vary from more philosophical analyses to more empirical studies. I myself have got a chapter in that I've co-written with colleagues from the University of Cape Town and the University of Witwatersrand, that is titled The Embattled University, Orders of Power and the Failure of Transformation. And then my colleagues, Dr. Mabukwana and Professor Mkhize and Ms. Makabuka have got a chapter in on demographic and institutional trends. And we also have from Dr. Mabukwana and some other co-authors a chapter on Africa-centered curricula. And I also, we've got quite a good representation of universities from, let me just get back to this main, from of course Mandela University, but also Stellenbosch, from the Free State, University of Pretoria, and so forth. And yeah, so quite excited about this taking shape, and hoping that we will have our manuscript pulled together by the middle of this year, and perhaps even publication before the end of the year, which would be great. So yeah, and I'm contactable on my email address if anybody wants any more information. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Christy. I think that book's going to be timely, hey? Andre, I think you wanted to come in now with Luan to talk about the NRF Critical University Studies project.
Yeah, thanks, Dina. Thanks, colleagues. This is fantastic, hearing to what people have been doing. Next slide, Jen. I just wanted to share that we, just in terms of our little histories, these were the roundtables we had in August 2019 and the different sets of workshops, which, of course, as many of you argued, gave us a bit of new direction and energy for driving the network around critical university studies. Next slide, Jen. And so on that basis, actually, I wrote a proposal, to the NRF, around this key premise. I changed it after the colloquium as well. I had this idea in my head for a long time, in the way in which our system produces distributions of worth between historically white universities and historically Black universities, even when those demographics have changed. And of course, if you then look at both in terms of discursive fields around the notions of excellence and around the notions of quality, those play themselves out, and they play themselves out with regard to the funding regimes and the funding distributions. So the system, to my mind, is actually more racialized now than it was in 1996. And so the argument for me was then, given the fact that higher education studies and or higher education transformation studies doesn't have a sharp interpretive scheme for tackling these challenges, we had a particular type of critical university studies in mind that wants to set itself apart from, say, for instance, its European version, who had this idea that there was a good university some few decades ago in its mind. That's its departure point, and it wants to return there. And that is not our departure point. Next slide, Jenny. And within that context, we had then these three objectives. And of course, in fact, despite the challenges of the pandemic, there's a few things that we couldn't do. The building the network across the continent, because that would have required so many different kinds of real work that we needed to do within the spaces of the East African University Association, colleagues and friends we made in Kenya, and then of course, the higher education divisions of the African Union. That work couldn't happen. But Michael will assist us as and when that is required. But we certainly need to find new ways of connecting with our continent and her epistemic histories and intellectual traditions in a much, much more stronger and authentic way, Next slide, please. And I think this is where Luan comes in. Yes, Luan.
Yes, thanks, Prof. So just shortly on the progress of the project, as Prof mentioned, has been rather challenging in terms of networking and building our networks and building our workshops and colloquium and seminar series. But hopefully this space will allow that to continue until we can meet each other again physically. But our research report or research project, which was the first objective, that will be available in the end of March. And then from that, we will start publishing. Jenny can go to the next slide. And our mapping project, which we focused on last year, was between traditional higher education studies, the more South African so-called higher education transformation studies, and critical university studies. And if you look at the screen at the moment, we just tried to look at what are the main questions that could be expected, and we find in the literature review that is asked in a typical higher education study, higher education transformation studies, and in critical university studies. And whilst the particular question at hand or the subject which might be under analysis might be the same, the dispositions are definitely quite different. And the most important difference is critical university studies focus on ideological analysis and linking whatever phenomena is under discussion, whatever phenomena comes forth within the study is linked to the broader question of imaginings and imaginations and ideas of the university. So yes, I might ask the same question of student experience, a staff experience, but CUS always asks that question in relation to what is the idea and the ideology of the university. Jenny, can we go to the next slide? And if we then had to look at CUS unto itself, as we discussed at the 2019 Winter School, and we kind of delved a bit deeper into it in the last year's mapping review and literature review, is how CUS almost has these two different competing traditions. So where CUS and its name CUS comes from an Anglo-American tradition, as Prof just mentioned, hearkening back to this idea that once there was this utopia, once there was this university that was good, which is just, which is righteous. And somehow in the 90s, this changed by the onset of global neoliberalism, global capitalism as we know it today. And so the CUS in the mainstream, as it is enunciated and pronounced in book series and journal articles, is this idea of returning. But then there's this alternate tradition, which goes much further back and goes back into critical pedagogies, decolonial studies, and even emerging studies such as Sharon mentioned, critical internationalization studies, which says that university was never perfect. In fact, the university is rooted and is based within unjust and unequitable and extractive modes of thought and modes of being. So we have these two traditions and we can see them vying. And that's why we also have seen this emergence of so-called abolitionist university studies, which Sharon also alluded to, which says moving beyond the idea of the university, finding new imaginings, finding new ideas. And that is what we're trying to enunciate here as well, new ideas of Africa in the university, Africa from the university, and the university for Africa. Thank you. Yes, Prof. Jenny, you can go to the next slide.
And colleagues, this is just how we present this project. So we have a number of young people and young academics, sorry, Aslam, for that, and young academics into the space. And if Nobu is here, Nobu has just been appointed as a lecturer, via our emerging academics program, Nobu Pele Puza, and then Pedro, as you would know, has also gone through the structure last year. So we are very chuffed that some of our systems are working out in the way that we had hoped they would do. And around that big yellow circle of critical university studies, we have the network. We have Kama Noveve as a PhD student, who's supported by the NRF grant, Nobubele Puza as a doctoral student in that space. And Jenny's postdoctoral work is also tied into literature studies and what it may teach for critical university studies. So all those are circling around that space. We are building a massive online resource on higher education transformation, capturing so much of the work being done internationally and nationally since 1996, and so we've appointed a postdoc driving that project. And then, of course, we have groups and reading groups around the question of decolonization. And then, of course, the question of Africanization, and Omalanga, who's in this group, also holds together the Africa and Knowledge Seminar Series with the Center for Philosophy in Africa. And we try to build this out in so many different kinds of ways so that the Africanization project can have a critical conversation with the decolonization project in so many different kinds of respects as well. Okay, colleagues, so that's the work on critical university studies. And so we have a number of young people working in that space. Last slide, Jenny. And this is how we knock together the diagram that depicts how we work around the network itself. So it's the three of us coordinating the network. We have Kama and Nobu assisting us. In the South African chapter, we have myself, Aslam, and Michael Cross working on that. Jenny and myself working on this colloquium, and Jenny will also work on the seminar series now as soon as we're done with this one. And then the book project with Dina and Jason, with Luan in that space, and Dina around the website. So this is the totality. And of course, there are many more just by the way of reflecting on what you've been saying today, that makes up this particular network. And we know that networks are not easy to build, and that one needs some staying power and energy for this kind of work, to be productively move forward. I think that's the last slide. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much, Andre and Luan. Yeah, and thanks everybody who have spoken today. I know that there are many other people here today who are doing work that is also very, very important. And so, You're very welcome in the breakout sessions to speak about this, but also if you haven't had a chance now, you can email me with a slide of some of the stuff that you've done, and we can also share it on the website. So the conversation doesn't just have to be within this moment now. I'm going to hand over now to Andre to facilitate the next part of our interactions. But thank you, everybody who spoke now.
Thanks so much, Dina. Colleagues, I have put in the chat box, just what we will be doing in the breakaway groups. Jenny we will have a discussion of say 25 minutes because we're running slightly over time. Just choose a facilitator and a scribe, introduce your work, share your work and the project that you think may link up with critical university studies, then ideas to build the networks and what contributions you think you would like to make. But just before we do that breakout, just to say that we are very, very grateful for people who have tried their best, and worked very hard to hold the network together. This is not an easy time. It's not easy generally to hold networks together and also interacting with other networks. Sharon's Critical Internationalization Studies is a network that whenever I have the time, I like to engage with, and so is the Global Decenter Network. We will have our own local network once Aslam, myself, Michael, and Shireen pools our work together. And so, yeah, so it is fantastic that we are able, because the times call for a different way to study the university as a social institutions for new generative practices that are more liberatory and emancipatory to emerge in our space. So with that, colleagues, can I just ask Jenny then to initiate the breakaway sessions, and then just to remind yourselves of the 4 points for the breakaway discussions. And please do return when we have the short discussion in the breakaway group. We will be finishing by within the next 40 minutes, I promise you. Thank you so much. We're going to run slightly out of time. So can I just quickly kick them off with group 1 then? Just share with us. People can use 2 to 3 minutes. That would be great.
Okay, so room 1 was Des, Joseph, Laura, Nancy, Pamela, Rachel, Roxana, Sharon, and Sunwabo.
Okay.
So maybe they can go first.
All right, who's going first?
Yeah, great. I have to go first again. Okay. So
how did you end up being the scribe, Sharon? But okay.
I have that same question, but so we had some good conversation. So one thing that was emphasized was the importance of welcoming contributions from those who are generally not recognized or welcomed in the university space. So this question of people working in pop culture and hip hop and other communities who are not generally highlighted in this work. And then a conversation about how to do that in a good way, starting small and building the relationships, focusing on the quality of the relationships as opposed to kind of instrumentalizing people for certain outcomes. Related to that, the idea that some of the events of the network could include performance, art, and other non-traditional scholarly modes of engagement. Also this idea of building more kind of critical literacy around key concepts so that we have an informed position when we're doing this work. And related to that, needing to develop a critical mass of young scholars, especially scholars from the Global South, who will be leading in this area. And really emphasizing the need for those scholars to articulate their own experience instead of continuing this colonial pattern of being the object of study themselves. So another idea was having a newsletter that would circulate both to the network itself, but also to other South African universities and other universities in the Global South, also targeting post-grad students and new scholars. The idea of maybe as part of that or something else, inviting short non-conventional contributions about critical university studies. And then the idea of possibly a reading group, especially focused on some of the key concepts that would again target early career scholars and postgrads. And then just a general emphasis on, if we want to build a network, then we have to also build relationships and trust amongst ourselves in other ways. And if anyone has something important that I left out, I'm sorry, and feel free to jump in.
Thanks, Sharon. That sounds great, man. Thank you so much. Jenny, for the second group, just 1, 2 names.
No, it's that was the group I facilitated.
Okay, thanks.
Group 2.
Yes, swimming is.
But Oriel took the note. So
sorry, I thought we were group 4.
Oh, did you? No, I think we're group 2.
You are group 2. That's right.
Okay. Okay. So we had a large variety of contributions. It was fascinating. Ruth Bush is participating in a 5-year program looking at the creative lives of African universities and conversations about decoloniality in historically Francophone cultures. Simpiwe Mpo is part of the Center for Non-Racialism and Democracy and is looking at the cultural and sociological emancipatory imagination. Paulette Kotse here at NMU is working on a book about the destruction of whiteness. And I think that does inevitably link with the decolonizing of the university. Mary Duca is in visual arts at NMU, and she is very interested in seeing how art can contribute to this conversation about transformation and just be another way of contributing to this conversation. We had Nolotolo Nhlapo from Rhodes University. Unfortunately, she had to leave, but she's a transformation director there, and she's very interested in being part of the space in the future. And then Michael commented that it is important that we all learn from each other's best practices. And I think it was from that it was developed that we are all contributing from various corners of the globe, which is quite an interesting product of the COVID era. Whereas before we might have kept our ideas in a smaller circle, we are now talking with people from further away. And Sue pointed out quite rightly that it means that we've got to be able to explain things more clearly and coherently and put them in context, which can actually enable us to put a critical lens on our own ideas when we have to explain them and their context to other people. I think that is everything.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks, Oriel.
Fantastic summary.
Thanks.
Thanks. Right, Jenny, give me a hint of group 3.
Group 3 was Zahar, Nomalanga, Jason, and yourself.
I'm just gonna ask somebody to present. Pedro, please present.
Right, thanks, Prof. Thanks, Jenny. And just to be brief, what came out strongly, firstly, on the key questions that were asked, was how do we have a network that has truly liberating solidarities between the global north and the global south, and that can be anchored outside surfacing people's careers, and the fact that what does it take to build this solidarity network within a globally unequal space, and what is it that each person can contribute, which would be the conscious of the network, and the fact that paying attention to that liberalism that is taking place in European universities has affected what is happening in our universities in the continent. So in a nutshell, how do we also pull in more relationships between a variety of disciplines, such as economics, occupational therapists, and so on, moving beyond people just in humanities, because they seem to be saying the same things around these questions. And then lastly, on people's projects, we have Luzuko working on representations of universities, looking at how South African higher education institutions present themselves in public for purposes of marketing, whereas they still have to grapple with pressing questions of transformation. So how do you grapple with those two issues? We also have Munira on African occupational therapy for mental health in the workplace, looking at it through the decolonization lens. And she's also involved with therapists that are looking at systematic racism around the country. And they're also working with student leadership. The team is called Student Leadership Team at Stellenbosch University, looking at questions of transformation and diversity, basically for purposes of learning more about people that they'll be dealing with in terms of where they come from. And then the last two, if I could try to move quickly because of time. We also have colleagues looking at Luan, philosophy, literature, and linguistics, the gaps between the local and the universal, and trying to examine those gaps and binaries. Jason, involved in a book project with the Manchester University Press that focuses on race and social justice. And then Professor Andre Kitt, you all heard the projects that he's involved in the previous session. He's our Deputy Vice Chancellor and Chair for Preshet. And then Saha, looking at universities as machines and how can they be made to be more humanizing, and also questions on transformational transnationality of transformation. Hey, Saha, your English. Yeah, and then Nomalanga, the historian, not fond of theories, but more of an empiricist. Nomalanga, the professor, defined herself as a more traditional historian. And then Jenny, looking at what literature studies and English can contribute to critical investor studies network. In a nutshell, colleagues, that's basically what the group reflected on. But the major question that came out for everyone to reflect on is, what does it take to build this network with solidarities within a globally unequal space?
Wonderful. Thanks, Pedro. Then group 4.
Our group had able representation of people from diverse fields and with diverse backgrounds. We had practitioners, we had students, and we had researchers, both emerging and seasoned researchers. And some of the interests that were represented in our group included language development, institutional culture, peace and conflict, non-racialism, an interest in developing a reading group, and then organizational change. Some of the ideas that came from the group included for critical university studies to have focused conversations by identifying special interests, for example, of each one, and then developing groups around that. And one of those that eventually emerged from our discussions were conversations on institutional culture, to address questions of institutional culture, which can become a potential subgroup and have a network around it. And then we had ideas coming up on the need for an intersection between institutional culture and aspects like historical marginalization and exclusion, and essentially not only focusing on race, even when race was considered important, but for instance, looking at historically Black universities from other points of marginalization as well and exclusion. Then the other point that came up was the need to pool
work from critical university studies into practice from the administrative point of view, for instance. And this could be done, could be considered within the scope of critical university studies by encouraging possibilities for research projects on monitoring and evaluation, and also organizational culture as a way of doing this. So those are some of the things that came up from our group. And another point that emerged was that there's a database, and colleagues were encouraged to submit their interest areas so that that database can be grown further as a resource. It's a resource, a one-place resource for critical university studies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. This is some great work coming through. And in fact, I'm going to try and pull these together. Mike and Dina, the two of you will have to assist me as well, because we're also running out of time. Just to say thank you so much to everybody who participated in these in the groups. And I see there are people rejoining as well. Our numbers have been staying actually very stable. So this is fantastic. Just shows the commitment. I like that first idea that came through with regard to non-conventional forms of work that people are doing, both in terms of art and performing arts and pop culture, hip-hop culture. And we will have to think about how we pull a special interest group together on that, colleagues. That will be my one. And then, of course, as to how young scholars from the global south can drive that area of interest within which the entire critical university studies community needs to engage with. And of course, as well, the question of critical literacy on key concepts. We will have to think also perhaps how we mobilize, some of the workshops that Sharon has been running, across our own spaces as well, especially around the question of critical literacies within our own area. The question of the newsletter that has been raised a few times as well, and the question of the reading groups have been raised now by three groups, and so we will have to think about that. And so we will note that, and when we write up the different sets of action notes for the for this workshop, for this first session, we will certainly then call on people to avail themselves to assist us with some of those. Then the question of a 5-year project on the idea and orientation of the African University. Of course, tomorrow we will be hearing from Paul Zeleza on this particular topic as well, and especially African studies in relation to the critical university project. But he's going to speak about from a management perspective as to how universities on our continent respond to COVID-19. And that may be an area within which we can think about a project like that. I'm glad to hear that Norokolo was here. I didn't pick her up, so thanks for that. But the question of the visual arts was also raised again in there. And then the idea of learning from one another, which ties in with Pedro's point in group 3. Because the truly, authentic solidarities between scholars from different geographical areas, paradigms and all those kinds of things will have to call upon us to devise programs to make that achievable, okay? So it's not going to fall out of the sky unless we pull the different areas of interest together, bring networks together, have bilaterals, have trilaterals, have projects, and so on into the space, but also the practical import of our work within the universities ourselves. I can certainly say within our own university, Nelson Mandela University, the interplay between what really happens within the university and what one say around a particular kind of intellectual project, we certainly work at that particular gap very, very hard. And of course, I have colleagues here that will affirm that though everything is not perfect, but we certainly try to have a reorientation of the university that reflects the idea of what we say a university should be. Very difficult and hard work, but some of those shapes are falling into place. Those solidarities and those connections between theory and praxis, we will have to highlight as one of the key areas. And the same around the question of pulling, scholars and activists together around the questions of the disciplines. Munir, I've had an occupational therapy student as a PhD student. I think 2 years ago she graduated, and so that particular area has been raised a couple of times as to how do the disciplines connect with one another from a critical angle, and how do we build, across not only the humanities, but across the so-called art sciences as well. So thanks for that point being raised, Monique. And of course, though you may find it very strange as to what would be your role in the network, that's precisely what we would like to see, so from your own disciplinary base, drive the objectives of critical university studies. Then the question of language development, the question of institutional culture and peace and conflict came very strong through in the last group's presentation. We will have to tie that into the work that Christy has been doing, but also perhaps a broader subgroup on universities and institutional culture, and how such subgroups, of course, can busy themselves with real practical projects. Now, for those of you who know me for long enough knows that I don't make a distinction between theory and practice. I don't honor them in my head, because both of them are doing things and they support one another in different kinds of ways. And I certainly try to do that in the way in which I work, practically, as well as the way in which my thought processes are organized. So I suspect that when we argue around these things, it's more or less what kind of practical implementation program we can envisage for ourselves as a group when we move forward. So colleague, that's how I capture this, and I hope then that we can, in a report fashion and feedback into the group, have some of those areas lined out. Jenny outlined. I'm sorry for that. So that people can volunteer themselves into those spaces. Dina and Michael, before I close this meeting, I'm so sorry that we will have to rush through this. My apologies. I actually have another meeting to go to in 5 minutes time. Mike?
Great, thank you. This has been wonderful hearing from so many different people from their perspectives. What came out of our group, particularly because of what Ruth is doing with the Francophone countries, is, as you know, we've considered this whole idea of expanding our network also across the continent. Keep in mind, continent goes beyond the English-speaking countries. So whatever we can do to sort of draw into our network, those places where French typically spoken or Portuguese, we should begin to think about them. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. In fact, I just had a meeting with a colleague from Eduardo Mondlane University last week, so Mike, so we will have to think about that. Thanks for coming through in that group. Dina?
Yeah, just I guess to thank everybody. We've got some great ideas and some great energy here. And I think the next 2 days, also when we listen to our speakers, it'll be really good. And I just look forward to interactions, and just thank everybody for their time and sitting through this and really contributing within the breakout groups.
Oh yeah, thanks again, colleagues from the three of us. It's
thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Can I just say then have a lovely evening or morning or day further, depending on where you are at in the world. So thanks so much for this. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.